Hello, thanks for joining us today. My name is Dr. John Bagnulo, and I'm really happy to be with you today and to be joined by Laura Dority, uh, who's a phenomenal RD. Has so much clinical experience, in the area of gut health, improving patient outcomes. And today we're going to really, hopefully, shed light on some of the confusion around fiber and different classes of carbohydrates that sometimes are looked at as essentially types of fiber and how that relates or influences gut health. A lot to cover here. So let's dive in. Just first, complete disclosure here. I serve as director of nutrition for nutritional medicinals, and Laura is our national clinical manager. So, both of us are really proud to be to be employees of that company, which of course uses Blenderized formulas, which are rich in fiber. So that's why this is near and dear to us. We have, four primary objectives for participants today. Number one, understand the relationship between carbohydrates, especially what I like to refer as MACs, microbially accessible carbohydrates, carbohydrates that can really feed good gut bacteria, and fiber, and how that really can help shape the gut microbiome. Be able to differentiate between different types of carbohydrates and fibers, and look at the roles that they have in improving or influencing overall health. We'd like everyone to be able to gain insight into the detrimental role of certain types of carbohydrates and even some unique types of fiber that aren't as beneficial as people often believe. And then a review of the current literature on fiber supplementation, meeting fiber goals in clinical practice. So that's what we hope to achieve. I'm going to start though with this slide, which really shows the broad category we call polysaccharides. Of course, saccharides are sugar units, and that's what carbohydrates and fiber and really everything from that world, they're made up of sugar molecules, and those sugar molecules are going to be bonded to one another in different forms, right? The one that we really focused on is that beta 1,6 glycosidic bond, which is very difficult for us in our digestive efforts to cleave, but can be acted upon by bacteria in what we call fermentation to break down those types of polysaccharides or carbohydrates. But we've got these three major categories, right? We've got, starches, which sometimes, because of the way they are arranged, can act very similar to fiber in terms of feeding gut bacteria. But we're going to mostly focus on, on fiber and really help you understand today the two types of fiber that are found commonly in foods, obviously soluble and insoluble, and give you some examples of those. But I like this slide because it kind of shows you that hierarchy of polysaccharides and how things are arranged, in that way. And then of course there's glycogen. We're not going to spend much time talking about glycogen, but that is a form of a complex carbohydrate. Very easy for us to free up glucose from that. And so because of that, we're going to help you understand that starches are highly branched groups of carbohydrates, and we call that amylopectin. And then the analogy to that is going to be the glycogen, which looks very, very similar to amylopectin, but is stored in the body. But again, I digress here. We're mostly focused on fiber. And so with that, let's take a look at what starch looks like and what cellulose looks like. Of course, I've talked about glycogen here briefly. You can see that it's highly branched, right? I mean, it's it's just a real network of all these glucose molecules ready to be acted upon when we need instant energy. And then you've got starch, which looks, again, in this case, this is potato starch. You can see that it is also branched. More amylopectin here. Amylose tends to be long and more linear. And then you see cellulose at the bottom, the fiber from a plant wall. And it's long and it's straight chained, but because of the presence of so many beta 1,6 glycosidic bonds, it's very, very difficult to break those glucose molecules into individual units. Then you have here where some of these different types of carbohydrates or polysaccharides are coming from. And you've got all these different components now that you can see within plant tissue. I like this three-dimensional image here. You can see that you got hemicellulose and pectin, which a lot of us are familiar with because it's found in fruit. You've got the cellulose. All of those three ultimately make up a plant's primary wall. And intertwined in all of this, you've got the polyphenols and the tannins and the ligands, and all of these things feed gut bacteria. They all have really fascinating roles with respect to human physiology. So that's, in essence, where all these different components are found. They're all found in plant walls. Now, we're going to look, really closely at these highly fermentable carbohydrates, which are front and center on this slide. And they're fermentable because bacteria in the distal GI, in our case, distal small intestine, but more large intestine, bacteria there are going to work on those types of carbohydrates. And they're soluble if they basically form more of like a viscous-like gel. That's the best way that any of us can really understand soluble fibers. They tend to swell up with water, and also, in addition to that, because insoluble fibers can swell up with water too, in addition to taking on that, they will form a mucus or gel-like material. But most importantly for the microbiome, they are easily fermented and converted into various metabolites. Now, the non-soluble or fiber that we like to refer to as insoluble fiber, that has very low levels of fermentability. But you can see here that you've got some very important types of fiber for other areas of health that could fall in each of those categories. Here's another chart that helps us understand soluble fiber clearly. If it forms a viscous-like gel when it's hydrolyzed, it's soluble. If it doesn't, something like wheat bran, it's an insoluble fiber. And wheat bran is not a fiber that I really like to see clinicians recommend for patients. I think it has some detrimental effects on the gut wall. That would be an example of an insoluble fiber that's really not biologically a good fit for our GI. It might promote laxative-like effects and regularity, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good fit. So the insoluble fiber is where you have to sometimes be careful in terms of, is that really a good fit for human physiology, especially at the gut wall. But on the soluble side of things, if it forms a viscous-like gel, in general, it has very favorable effects on our health. Everything from the ability to lower certain blood lipids, improving glycemic control, and obviously what I'm most interested in, for my role as a clinician, and in my R&D work, it acts as a prebiotic, right? So it helps feed really good commensal gut bacteria, which can do, amazing things for our health, turning off, unfavorable genes, anti-inflammatory effects, the list goes on and on. But if you get down to the very bottom, you're going to get some great examples of some of the more viscous soluble fibers. And there's one, beta-D-glucan, that you see at the top. That's a type of soluble fiber that I'm a huge fan of because of its ability to bind onto bile acids. That's the primary way the body eliminates toxins. And so having more beta-D-glucan in your diet or in your patients' formulas or the way that they eat is going to be very helpful to helping their hepatobiliary system dump some of those toxins. And an example of beta-D-glucan would be beets. Beets are the richest source of that beta-D-glucan. Carrots are a pretty good source as well. But that's just a phenomenal type of soluble fiber. And you can see pectin is in there as well. And then there's, again, there's a long list of these for us to consider here, but this is just a good chart to refer to. Again, functionality, you can see that all of those fibers in the brown, they have some functionality. And then you can see the specific types of them below in the orange, with resistant starch being categorized now as a fiber. Technically it is, because resistant starch has a very low level of bioavailability to us. Our amylase is not going to break down that resistant starch. Only gut bacteria are going to do that. So technically it's a fiber when you think about our inability to digest that and to absorb it intact. And it has, immense benefits, especially with respect to feeding really important families of bacteria. So, you can see that there's a, wide range here: functionality, structure, specific type, and then you look at the physiological effects that are, these are just a few, and these are some of the really more basic ones, right? I mean, laxative-like effects, glycemic control, satiety. But when you get down into things like immune support, I think that's where it becomes really interesting. Now, now we're going to just embark here on what it is that fiber does, from producing important metabolites, and the best example of that is a short chain fatty acid, to, again, helping form a viscous-like substance that can have a lot of benefits to the gut wall, into various facets of our health, to the immune system, which we just mentioned. So you can see here that a prudent diet, which is one, again, higher in soluble fiber, has all of these different effects, and all of that comes down to providing gut bacteria with what that population of bacteria ultimately need, which is a food source to maintain a healthy population with, as well as a food source to generate these short chain fatty acids, which are a byproduct of fermentation. And when you get those short chain fatty acids, that feeds the cells of the intestinal wall. They only really can utilize certain fuel sources, and those short chain fatty acids are a very important one that allows the gut wall to produce a nice thick mucus layer, which is protective and keeps the tight junctions tightly intact. Now, on the other side, if you have an absence of these things, that's when you have an erosion of the gut wall, you have a loss of that thick protective mucus layer, you have a widening of those gap junctions, and that ultimately is a compromised gut wall or intestinal barrier that leads to more inflammation. So, and that, as clinicians, right, and this is a great paper. This is a great paper. If you look at this one by Hewler, you can see the role of fiber in enteral nutrition in preventing sepsis. It's a great paper, 2023. It's a new one that really highlights the importance of having fiber in an enteral formula in an effort to maintain an intact gut wall and to prevent sepsis. I mean, look, sepsis is that's our greatest concern when you have a patient that's going to be on long-term enteral support and it's in a critical condition. So it's a great paper, especially if you are, if you're in that clinical area, trying to help patients that are in an ICU or a critical care unit and are on, at high risk for sepsis. This paper really highlights the importance of having not just fiber, but having whole and wide varieties of fiber in that enteral formula. Again, Blenderized being the best example of that. When that mucus layer breaks down, that mucus layer is very, very important. You have to have certain microbes present to maintain that. When that breaks down, again, this is what compromises the immune system and lets endotoxins and pathogens into our bloodstream, again, because of that gut wall, which, keep in mind, we've got around 77 to 78% of our immune system lies within 1 centimeter of our gut wall. So that shows you really the importance of that gut wall and how it is paramount that it be maintained intact with tight configurations. And there's a reason why all of our immune system is so close there. Those tight junctions are kept there by these tiny proteins. Occludin is an example of that, and occludin really helps keep a tight junction tight. That's how you get normal transport. But we know that patients with low levels of fiber and unfortunately the subsequent dysbiosis that comes with low levels of dietary fiber, either low levels of fiber, inadequate amounts of microbially accessible carbohydrates, when that type of situation develops, then the families of bacteria that help maintain tight gap junctions, they disappear. Higher levels of zonulin would be another situation where the gap junctions would break down and widen, and that really compromises a patient's immune system, leading to everything from chronic diarrhea, malabsorption, host of allergies and reactions and intolerances. And so really correcting this is the key. And that, again, is going to rely on bringing back fiber to a patient's diet or formula. I love this three-dimensional model. It shows you what we've been talking about here in the role of, in this case, Faecalibacter prausnitzii. Faecalibacter prausnitzii is a well-known and heavily studied bacteria that converts fiber to N-butyrate, one of the most important short-chain fatty acids to human health. And that N-butyrate is anti-inflammatory. It helps keep the immune system in check. In absence of Faecalibacter prausnitzii, and or, as you can see here clearly, and or an absence of specific types of dietary fiber, those which are found in vegetables. And I really emphasize that because the fiber found in certain grains or cereals is inadequate at helping achieve this. When we have an absence of either an important commensal species of bacteria, or we have an absence of these microbially accessible carbohydrates, which are certain types of fibers and resistant starch, then you can see that you get these leaky cell junctions or gap junctions. And in essence, you have sepsis and you have the inflammatory response that results. So again, this really speaks to the importance of both. You got to have the ecosystem, and you also have to have the food that is going to help nurture and keep that ecosystem intact. This shows you the primary and secondary fiber and starch degraders. Bifidobacter, it may be one of the most, if not the most important species of bacteria in the human gut. Researchers have shown that we lose more and more bifidobacter as we grow older. There are different theories as to why that is, but we know that by the time the average adult is around 50 years old, bifidobacter populations tend to go into steep decline, and that's when we tend to see the highest incidence of inflammatory disorders and cancer and things like that. So there are really a lot of different theories around bifidobacter, but we know it's an immensely important bacteria. It needs resistant starch and certain forms of polysaccharides, and it really gets the process going. And then the intermediate products are some of these short chain fatty acids and certain oligosaccharides, and then the N-butyrate producers. That's what really brings that to completion with a more thorough fermentation and production of the ultimate short chain fatty acid N-butyrate, which we just talked about or was depicted on the previous slide. And you can see that, again, Faecalibacter prausnitzii is part of this family, or is part of this important group, I should say, of bacteria, along with Roseburia. And it's not saying that we're really only focused on these families of bacteria. There are many others that play important roles in the microbiome, but these are the ones that are required to convert a resistant starch or a fiber to N-butyrate, the most important short chain fatty acid. And it's, again, much more complex. There's, the ability for these specific types of vegetable fibers, and I keep emphasizing vegetable fibers. I'm not just going to say fiber, because if I just say fiber, I feel like many clinicians and patients and their families, they tend to turn to brand cereals and things like that. And you can look here. If you look on the right-hand side of the slide, you can look at the relative risk what's the risk here that in reduction, you can see that you're not getting really significant benefits from cereal like you are vegetable. The vegetable fiber really is the most significant risk reduction, not only for, again, metabolic syndrome diseases such as diabetes and heart disease, but for overall all-cause mortality, mortality from cancer. It's all about vegetable fiber because it has such strong anti-inflammatory processes. It feeds a much, much greater variety of commensal or beneficial bacteria. And it just, again, it's a much more holistic way to go in terms of feeding the microbiome. Now I'll really narrow things down here as I start to wind up my my section before I hand it over to Laura and just say, take a look at this. This is looking at blenderized tube feeds versus your typical commercial formulas. And you can see that if we focus on the diversity index, which looks at the different species of important or commensal bacteria found in the microbiome, you can see that the higher percentage of calories from a blenderized tube feed leads to a much greater diversity, Shannon diversity index, speaking to the, the ability for blenderized tube feeds to feed important gut bacteria populations. In comparison to a commercial formula, it's a stark contrast. And then if we look at a marker of inflammation, you can see the blenderized tube feeds have a tight cluster, very low levels of fecal calprotectin in comparison to the commercial formulas, where there's a wide range of this particular marker of inflammation. And it's much more spread out, but statistically, it's clear that blenderized tube feeds result in lower levels of intestinal inflammation and higher levels of important gut bacteria. And again, that's looking at a biomarker, that's looking at a microbiome assay. But if we look at outcomes, you can see that blenderized tube feeds, as a result of that, decreased gastrointestinal symptoms, tend to have lower body mass indexes with 100% blenderized formulas, higher levels of micronutrients. Obviously, this is what I'm getting at, higher levels of fiber with blenderized tube feeds. And obviously with that comes the higher levels of microbial diversity in the gut. So, and that's what we're after, because those things all equate to improved clinical outcomes. And with that being said, I'll turn it over to Laura.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Bagnulo. So I think I want to start off by reading a quote from the current Aspen president, Dr. Gail Crushy, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing that name incorrectly. But this quote actually comes from her presidential address titled Medical Nutrition Therapy, Is It Time to Get Personal? That was published in March of 2023 in JPEN. If you haven't read the full article, I would encourage you to do so, because it's excellent and really shines a light on what the future may hold for the nutrition and enteral field. So on to the quote. Several societies and associations have nutrition guidelines for the prevention and management of disease. They all have a central theme: recommending Americans eat a variety of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, fiber, lean meats, and plant-based sources of protein, as well as less added sugar and less processed food. And I'm going to pause this quote there, so I'm leaving the ... because we're going to come back to it towards the end of my section. So let's talk about fiber recommendations. And I'm going to discuss both fiber recommendations for the overall healthy population, but also in a few slides, I'm going to take a deeper dive into fiber recommendations for enteral nutrition therapy and ICU patients as well. So to start off, the American Heart Association recommends total dietary fiber intake should be 25 to 30 grams a day. And the recommendation is for total fiber to come from food and not supplements. The Institute of Medicine also has a fiber recommendation. So this one's a little different because it's actually 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories, which is technically the established DRI, which technically is an adequate intake at this point. And so based on average calories, when we're looking at this recommendation, it's divided up based off gender and age, and that ends up being 38 grams of fiber for men aged 18 to 50, and 30 grams for men older than 50. For women, it ends up being 25 grams for the 18 to 50 age group and 21 grams for those over 50. But again, keeping in mind, this is truly 14 grams per 1,000 calories. So these are just average calorie intakes, but it really boils down to the amount of calories the person is eating or needs. Now, taking a deeper dive into the details of these recommendations, both the Institute of Medicine, the DRI, and the American Heart Association, there are no specific dietary reference intakes for soluble or insoluble fiber in terms of like how much soluble and how much insoluble. But many experts agree that about 1/4 of the total fiber should be soluble, at least 1/4 of the total fiber should be soluble fiber, which ends up being 6 to 8 grams a day. Now, I may argue as we learn more and more and more about fiber every year that this number probably is going to grow, alluding to all the things that Dr. Bagnulo always spoke about in terms of the gut microbiome. But for now, that's kind of where we are with published research. Both of the recommendations I briefly mentioned specifically say that fiber really should come from whole foods, if at all possible, versus fiber supplements. As we all know, whole foods are better sources of not just fiber, but vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients. So with that being said, the problem is most Americans only intake about 15 grams a day. So that's the average dietary fiber intake of Americans. So that's approximately half the recommended amount. And then recent NHANES data showed that only 7% of US adults meet the adequate intake for fiber of 14 grams per 1,000 calories. So I'm going to take a second and let that sink in. Half the recommended amount, and only 7% meet the goal of the adequate intake. That's a huge gap that needs to be filled. We have a lot of work to do in this area. And if you think about the overall impact on health, when you are missing 50% of any nutrient, fiber, vitamin D, it's going to be hugely detrimental to a lot of the points Dr. Bagnulo made and just overall health. So here are kind of my top 5 ways to increase fiber, and keeping in mind most of my clinical background is in pediatrics. And I'm sure most of these are not super exciting or new to you, but these are kind of the ways I choose to talk to clients, patients, and my family when they ask me for nutrition advice about fiber. So switching to whole grains. So if I have a family that's eating a lot of processed grains, a lot of white bread, a lot of white rice, it's a good place to start there by switching them to whole grains. Do I think that fruit and vegetable fiber is ideal? Yes. But I have to meet people in the middle of where they are. And if they're eating a lot of white bread, switching to whole grain bread can make a difference. Really focusing on substituting legumes or beans for meat 2 to 3 times per week. Chili is an easy one. Soup is an easy one. This can also help cut back on food budgets, because we all know groceries have gotten very expensive over the past few years. I also love to tell families to bulk up their baked goods by adding, vegetables to muffins, or focusing on ways to get in more fruit into baked goods and that sort of thing as well. Eat whole fruits instead of drinking juice, and really trying to include at least 1 serving of whole grain in every meal if they are not big fruit or vegetable eaters. Now, I'm sure y'all have 100 more great ways to increase fiber, and I hope we do have some time at the end. So if you want to put in some great ideas into the questions, I'm hoping I get to read some of those other ideas from y'all. So I love talking to people about optimizing their salads, because I think salads can be very boring. I'm a big salad eater myself, but it does get very, very boring. And many individuals already do the top 5 tips I already listed. So I want to go over this slide that is a way for people to take their salad to the next level. And this is a way to add 12 grams of fiber to a salad. So that's 12 grams in addition to what fiber they're going to get from the leafy greens themselves. So adding 1 tablespoon of, say, wheat germ, that's going to give you 1 gram of fiber. Adding 1/2 cup of garbanzo beans, that's going to give you 6 grams of fiber, and that's a good soluble source. And that's really a big bang for your buck there. 1/2 cup of blueberries or strawberries is going to be approximately 2 to 3 grams. 1/4 cup of grated carrots is 1, and then 2 tablespoons of almonds is 1.5. So the thing I want to point out is that this is a variety of fiber sources. It's not just fruits, it's not just veggies, it's not just beans. It's really a fiber source from almost all of the food groups. So before we switch gears here to enteral nutrition and fiber, a few clinical pearls I want to leave behind. You're really choosing dietary fibers versus functional fibers as much as possible. So keeping in mind that dietary fiber is found naturally in food, and functional fiber is added to foods. It's usually labeled as like inulin or chicory root. Those are some of the more common ones. Choose whole foods to get the best fiber source possible and a mixture of fiber sources. So I think the easiest example of this is probably eating whole fruit versus fruit juice. Aim for a variety of fiber sources, including both soluble and insoluble. So, and keep in mind, I know for me as a dietitian, I like to put things into categories and be very analytical about things, but it's not easy to like say, okay, fruits are insoluble fiber, vegetables are this. It's not that clean cut because fruits have both insoluble and soluble fiber, so do vegetables. So it's not so black and white in terms of making lists of what foods to eat for insoluble and what foods to eat for soluble. Because really, if you're eating whole foods, plant-based foods, and you're eating a variety, you're going to get both fiber options. And remember that fermentable fiber is the fiber that the friendly gut bacteria are able to digest. And Dr. Bagnulo did a great job of walking us through that. You know, but those gut bacteria can then use that as a fuel source to increase the balance of friendly gut bacteria and then produce those short chain fatty acids. Most fermentable fibers are soluble, but there are also some insoluble fibers that can function in this way. So again, that's not super black and white either. The fermentable fibers are going to be your pectins, your beta-glucans, your guar gum, and oligofructose. And I think the best whole food source is going to be your beans and legumes. And so really a 1 cup serving of beans is going to provide almost up to half of the recommended daily intake of fiber. So that, again, a very cheap source of food from a budget-friendly standpoint, but really provides a lot of nutrition in a small amount. With all that being said, I do have to point out that fermentable fibers are the fiber that sometimes causes some gas. So if you have somebody who's not eating a lot of fiber, starting really slow, introducing that fiber can help combat that. Okay, so switching gears here to fiber and the role it can play in enteral nutrition. Fiber-containing formulas are well known and highly considered for the management of both diarrhea and constipation in long-term enteral nutrition patients. And this is really due to fiber's ability to maintain GI motility and regularity. Now, knowing that fiber-containing formulas are known for their benefits of regulating diarrhea and constipation, I think it's important to take a step back and identify that if I ask 10 different people, what is constipation? I'm going to get 10 different answers. Now, diarrhea, we probably have a more consistent perception of that, but constipation means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, especially when you're talking to patients, clients, caregivers. So when I'm in clinic and I'm truly trying to decide, does this kiddo, and again, I primarily have worked in pediatrics, have constipation, or do they just not go as frequently as maybe mom and dad think they should go? I really heavily rely on the Bristol stool chart. 1, because it's visual, and 2, because kids think it's funny to talk about poop, and so they get to point out to me, what does your poop look like? Then from there, I can document that, make a change in their enteral nutrition regimen, and then I have something consistently to go back to see what happens when I made the changes, what were the outcomes. The other clinic tool that is helpful is a GI symptom validity tool. And there are a lot to choose from here. So I don't have any recommendation for what's best. It's really going to depend on your practice and the situation. Some of these focus on IBS, some are more GERD related, some of them are very general. And most of them are just short, 3 to 5 questions, 3 to 5 minutes, where they'll fill this out in clinic for me, or there are a few of these that are like a 7-day e-diary. So they document their stooling over 7 days, and then they bring it to clinic with them. So more specifically, if we break down talking about enteral nutrition and soluble fiber, so the role of soluble fiber, it feeds the bacteria and microbiome of the large intestines, again, creating those short chain fatty acids. Those short chain fatty acids then act as an energy source and promote the absorption of water and electrolytes. So this is how they provide an anti-diarrheal effect, is that absorption of water and electrolytes really can combat the diarrhea. They also aid in the maintenance of the intestinal gut barrier and prevent that bacterial translocation. And they help with gastric emptying by retaining water, again, as it moves through that digestive system. So the soluble fiber is really the one that's going to have that anti-diarrheal effect. but it's not to say that insoluble fiber, just giving soluble fiber and enteral nutrition is the best choice either. Now, insoluble fiber, when it comes to enteral nutrition, does not dissolve in water. It's unaffected by digestive enzymes and triggers the secretion of mucus in the large intestines. So all three of those mechanisms provide a bulking effect by increasing the stool weight and increasing the stool transit time through the GI tract, which in turn may assist with preventing or alleviating constipation. So your insoluble fiber is more of your constipating beneficial type of fiber, excuse me. Now, enteral nutrition and gut microbiome. So enteral nutrition patients often receive interventions that have negative impacts on the gut microbiome. For example, acid-reducing medications. That's going to elevate the gastric pH, and it allows for the survival of pathogens. Antibiotics, which we all know destroy both pathogenic and beneficial microbes. Some of these patients may have inadequate gut nutrients due to TPN use or synthetic enteral formulas without any fiber. Another gut alteration is just altered feeding schedule. While sometimes continuous feeds are necessary for tolerance and other reasons, getting fed around the clock is not hormonally normal. So that can interfere with the gut microbiome as it never really has time to rest. So for example, when you and I are sleeping, we're not eating while we're sleeping, hopefully not. And so our gut is resting and repairing itself. But if you're feeding somebody continuously, say in the ICU, that mechanism isn't happening. And then of course, these patients are sick. And so the metabolic and psychological stress associated with illness can obviously also negatively impact the gut. So negative gut microbial effects of all these factors is concerning because the gut microbiome is essential for regulating immune response and inflammation, maintaining the gut barrier, assisting with digestion and absorption, synthesizing many metabolic byproducts such as hormones, enzymes, vitamins. So the gut is key to all of that. And these enteral nutrition patients have all these things working against them. So ultimately, fiber in this population is bigger than just diarrhea and constipation. Fiber is truly essential for maintaining a healthy gut microbiome and then improving outcomes. So the fiber options out there in the enteral nutrition world, it is really varied. So you will have things from gums and polysaccharides to whole food fibers. Some products only contain one type of fiber. Other products contain a variety of fibers. And so for me, I think the key is choosing a formula with both insoluble and soluble sources because they work differently, they have different benefits. And I also think it's important to have a variety of fiber sources in the formula in terms of not just one added fiber. One of the controversial areas of fiber intake in the clinical community is in the ICU setting. So current guidelines are scarce when it comes to this population. So the Church Review article that I have referenced here on this slide, it's the enteral nutrition product formulation, a review of available products. It states it may be beneficial to provide fiber in a medically stable hospitalized patient or long-term home enteral nutrition patient, but one must use caution with the use of fiber in the critical care setting. And then if we dig deeper and we start looking at the Aspen and Society of Critical Care Medicine guidelines from 2016, they were inconclusive about the routine use of fiber in clinical practice. The guidelines suggested a mixed fiber formula should not be routinely used in the adult critically ill, prophylactically to promote regularity or prevent diarrhea. However, I want to point out that this recommendation was rated as low on the grade for quality of evidence. And what that means by definition in this article is that further research is very likely to have an important impact on confidence in the estimate of effect. So basically what that means is there's not a lot of research out there as of 2016 when this was written. And the reviewers were like, probably when we do more research, there's a high likelihood that this recommendation may be changing. And I think one thing that I always think about this guideline is that why is the default no fiber in the ICU until proven safe versus the opposite, fiber in the ICU until proven unsafe. Because isn't there a potential with what we now know about fiber? And full disclosure, we've learned a lot in the past 7 years since this article came out. But that withholding fiber is actually hugely detrimental. I also think when we start putting all ICU patients into one bucket, we are doing them a disservice. They aren't all in the ICU with the same clinical scenario. So really focusing on the individual situation is ideal. The guidelines do go on to talk about and suggest the use of commercial soluble and insoluble containing formula in the presence of persistent diarrhea. And most of the research in the ICU has been done on diarrhea-related outcomes. They also go on to say a fermentable soluble fiber additive of 10 to 20 grams a day could be considered for routine use in hemodynamically stable medical ICU and surgical ICU patients, again, who have evidence of diarrhea. But like we pointed out and Dr. Bagnulo talked about, fiber is just so much more than gut motility. So I want to talk about just a few studies in the ICU that have come out since those guidelines. The first one is a systematic review and meta-analysis of 19 studies evaluating the safety, potential adverse effects, and health outcomes of using fiber-containing enteral nutrition formulations in adults in the critical ill units. The fiber content varied in these research articles from just soluble to just insoluble or a mixed amount of fiber. The fiber group had less diarrhea. I don't think that's probably shocking to any of us, but they also had a 39% lower risk of GI complications overall. And those GI complications are listed here. So abdominal distension, constipation, gastric residuals, nausea, vomiting. No group differences were noted in mortality and ICU or hospital length of stay. So there were no adverse reactions to the fiber groups. This study concluded that enteral nutrition formulas containing fiber may have no effect on adverse events with critical illness when compared with non-fiber formulations. Enteral nutrition formulas containing fiber or fiber supplementation may reduce incidence and severity of diarrhea and GI complications overall. Again, keeping in mind that most of the clinical trials with regards to enteral nutrition and fiber focus on diarrhea, but when a patient has diarrhea in the ICU setting, or any hospitalized setting really, it requires more nursing time because they're having to be changed more frequently. It puts them at risk for infection, among other adverse issues. So it's more than an inconvenience. This study looked at 129 ICU patients that had a median fiber intake of 13 grams in the fiber group versus no fiber in the control group. During the 72 hours after ICU admission, fiber was well tolerated and higher fiber intakes was associated with less decrease in short chain fatty acid producing bacteria. So that's a good thing. The high fiber intake group also had less abdominal distension and no increase in diarrhea or other adverse effects. A quote from the green article referenced on this slide, and you guys will receive the full list of references when I send out your CEU certificate, so you will get all of these references, states that despite shortcomings in the literature, soluble and mixed fiber supplemented enteral nutrition is safe and beneficial in most hemodynamically stable intensive care patients. More research is necessary to determine optimal fiber composition. So where do we go from here? On one hand, we have the USDA, the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, all recommending a diet high in fiber from whole plant sources that are also low in simple sugars and refined carbs. But on the other hand, we have minimal guidelines on fiber when it comes to enteral patients. And the formulas we often give patients are full of refined sugar, simple sugars, and little to no fiber. Well, I think Dr. Crushy, going back to this quote, said it really well in the 2023 presidential address. The formulations we provide patients requiring nutrition support are processed and synthetic, thus stripped of many vital nutrients and phytochemicals. Hospitals and long-term care facilities often follow similar patterns, compromising processed and low fiber containing food. This leads me to reflect on why do we neglect nutrition guidelines that support health and the question, why do the sickest patients receive the poorest foods? And so my feedback to that is I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg. We have work to do. We have learned so much about fiber in the past decade. It's an exciting field, but we have to find the right amount of fiber, the right combination of fibers to give to our enteral patients. And we really have to kind of shy away from this no fiber approach unless it's obviously medically indicated. We have work to do on measuring and quantifying clinical outcomes when it comes to fiber in specific disease states or clinical scenarios. As research methodology has advanced, data suggests that despite grouping people by disease or condition, their nutrition intervention should be personalized. So food for thought on this one. A patient that comes into the ICU who has historically eaten maybe a processed junk food diet for a large portion of their diet in their life is going to have a different gut microbiome at baseline and respond to fiber differently than someone who comes into the ICU who generally has historically eaten a very whole food healthy diet. So baseline gut microbiome makes a difference in outcomes in the ICU and hospitalized settings. So that's something else we have to keep in mind as we're looking at an individual approach for nutrition. So as I wrap up here, leaving you again with just some clinical pearls is keeping in mind that not all fibers are created equal. A mixture of fibers with different properties offers the most benefit for gut health and microbiome. You know, that's where fiber supplements, they're fine in certain situations as like maybe a last resort, but really focusing on whole food fibers gives you a much larger variety and benefit. Start low and go slow. I think we've all heard stories of maybe somebody who's eaten a really high fiber snack bar and it didn't go so well. You know, maybe their gut wasn't used to it. So going slow and starting low. Make sure you're considering the baseline diet and associated fiber amount. And most importantly, one size doesn't fit all approach. All right, so I am going to pull up the questions and hopefully y'all left me some comments on some of your fiber tips. While I'm doing that, these are our upcoming next 2 webinars. They are both free. We will be talking about short bowel syndrome with 2 guest speakers on the 24th of August. And then in September, we will have an oncology related, and you can head to our website to sign up for those. All right. So Dr. Bagnulo, are you ready for some questions, my friend?
Yeah, looking forward to it, Laura. Thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, so the first one for you is with beets as a good source of beta glucan, will roasting or boiling affect its bioavailability?
No, not at all. Both are great sources, so that's good news. No problem with cooking beets.
Okay, great. When patients are experiencing diarrhea due to antibiotics, is there a recommendation of a type of fiber, for example, maybe culturelle, to help with GI symptoms? Do you want to answer that one first?
Again, this is a really common question that I receive clinically, and you know, I think the short answer is it's important to stay away from monolithic approaches with fiber, meaning one type of fiber, whether that's cellulose, you know, whether that's pectin. I mean, we can say good things about all of these, but what's been shown is that it just doesn't work to throw one highly refined type of fiber into the microbiome. In fact, in the case of inulin, albeit, you know, if inulin is accompanied by sugar, it's really a very poor outcome that's been, at least in animal models, that's been exhibited. Animals do very poorly when they're given inulin in combination with refined carbohydrates, i.e. high sugar diets. And so, and that's because, again, you know, this is what we suffer from, and really in this country especially, is this monolithic approach where we're just going to throw one highly refined ingredient, or in this case type of fiber, into the microbiome and expect it to help. You need a wide variety of plant fibers. That's why I spent the time I did earlier on in this presentation trying to show, you know, all the different types that come in, everything from the leaves to the stalks of vegetables, how it's all part of that important milieu, so to speak, of a plant, and that's critical. So there's not one type of fiber. I would say if there was a food that could really help someone that has had a loss in microbiome diversity or has suffered from the use of long-term antibiotics, foods such as beets, zucchini, leeks, those are three of the absolute best foods with a very complex and microbiome fostering array of fiber. Okay, beets, zucchini, leeks. You've already talked about peas. You know, green peas are great. Those would be some of my best choices.
Great, thank you. The next question I'm going to take, what is your perspective on recommending brown rice for people from cultures who primarily eat white rice? No, I think that's a great question. So here's kind of where I stand on that. If somebody came into my house and told my family, I live in the South, to stop eating shrimp and grits, they'd lose me right away. So I'm a big proponent of meeting the patient where they are. And if it's a white rice culture, then I would not ask them to change to brown rice. I would primarily try and decrease maybe the portion size of the white rice that they consume, increase the portion of the culturally appropriate vegetables to get in more fiber that way. But I totally agree with the asker on this. I think it's fun getting rapport with the client and really making changes that fit their lifestyle, their culture, their budget, and all of those things are just as important as the recommendations that come out of my mouth. So yeah, that's a really great point, and I appreciate you asking. Let's see. Dr. Bagnulo, I think this question is in regards to the last two of your slides. Do the commercial tube feedings contain fiber that were compared to the blenderized tube feeding? Like, was the fiber amount equivalent?
No, not at all. No, I mean, most commercial formulas have, in general, an absence of fiber. And when fiber is present, again, it's one type that is highly refined and isolated. It's certainly not a complex array. That doesn't happen with commercial formulas because of their use of refined sources of carbohydrates and fats and protein. Everything's incredibly refined, and so when fiber is present in a commercial formula, it's definitely added, and it's usually one type, such as a cellulose or an inulin type.
Okay, great. And this next question, I think it'd be good for us both to answer, Dr. Bagnulo. So I'll go first. And so the question is, why is there concern of using fiber in the ICU? And I think from my clinical experience is a few different reasons. I think one, historically, we haven't understood the benefits of fiber over the GI motility rationale. Two, I think sometimes in the ICU, there's so much going on with the patient that the team doesn't want to throw another potential wrench in the situation, and they think, okay, the patient's got poor gut motility because they're on these paralytics and things like that. If you add fiber in there, it's going to cause more GI issues. I think that's always what I've been told in the clinical setting. I'm going to let Dr. Bagnulo also answer that from a more research standpoint.
Yeah, my summary on this is that you have clinicians and physicians that oversee ICUs that have either observed and on a case by case basis, or there's anecdotal evidence that some of the commercial formulas with added fiber may have led to bloating, may have caused some various types of GI complications. But again, those types of formulas, if in fact that's the issue and that's what's been observed, those are very different in terms of how a patient in that setting is going to respond in comparison to a blenderized formula, which contains inherent vegetable fiber from things like we've talked about, peas and carrots and things like that. You really can't compare the physiological effects and or the GI influences of a product that maybe contains added cellulose, added inulin, in essence, one type of, and let's just go again, let's go with whether it's soluble or insoluble, but just one type of fiber and it's added in some type of refined concentrated form, you can't compare that to the improved tolerance and the overall improvements that a patient will see in every area of their physiology to an array of vegetable fiber that occur naturally. So it's very different, and there are many cases of, and this has been shared with me by clinicians over the last 7 or 8 years. There are many cases where patients were given in an effort to improve GI function, were given anything from a cellulose powder. Again, that's a real common one. Wheat bran, which I've already spoken about. Those can be really detrimental to everything from nutrient absorption to gut wall health. Can cause significant amounts of distension. So, I really try to stay away from those types of fiber sources and really try to just use vegetables, and that's where I think Blenderized tube feeds really fit.
Great, thank you, Dr. Bagnulo. I'll answer this one. Do you find a chia a quality fiber? It seems to cause a lot of digestive upset for clients, but then again, people generally eat a large amount of it. I totally agree. You're on the mark. So I love chia as an overall nutritional just food. It's not only a great fiber source, in my opinion, but it's also a great fat source. It has omega-3s in it. But you're 100% right. If you just jump into eating a bunch of chia pudding, it's going to have potentially negative GI consequences. So I am definitely somebody there that's like, you start by adding some chia maybe to your yogurt or to your oatmeal, or more recently I've put it into like protein balls that I make for my kids, and adding it in small quantities, and that seems to be a better GI tolerance for that. Dr. Bagnulo, this question, where'd it go? Oh, here it is. What is your opinion of cooking and chilling white rice overnight to produce some resistant starch? Is there enough resistant starch formed to make a difference?
Absolutely, highly effective. White rice, even if it's just left to cool to room temperature, anywhere from 40 to 57% of the glucose in that white rice is going to become bio unavailable, meaning that we won't be able to free up the glucose with our salivary or pancreatic amylase. So it's very significant in that which all of the starch in that white rice that retrogrades in the cooling process, in essence, becomes resistant starch and can be great, not only in the fact that it's not going to raise blood sugar levels, but that it's going to feed gut bacteria. So there is a lot to that.
Awesome, thank you. What about fiber recommendations for C. diff? I've seen such conflicting evidence for this.
Very important with C. diff to limit sugars and refined carbohydrates. We know that C. difficile really favors that type of carbohydrate. It can be very detrimental to a patient's recovery. Fiber is important. The fiber, again, though, not in the form of inulin, not some type of added highly refined formula, but formula from whole vegetables, and of course those vegetables with lower sugar contents is going to be the best fit. And the other thing with C. difficile, it's very important to offer those patients a beneficial strain of yeast known as Saccharomyces boulardii. Saccharomyces boulardii has very strong anti-C. diff properties.
Great, thank you. And for your last question, Dr. Bagnulo, from a strictly fiber perspective, not taking into account sugar content or phytonutrients, are fruits as beneficial for soluble fiber as veggies?
No, I definitely take vegetables. I take vegetables over fruits. I mean, there are obviously fruits that have some decent sources of soluble fiber, but when you get into some of the better vegetables, there's no comparison. I mean, the zucchini that I mentioned earlier, various types of squash, those things are phenomenal for their soluble fiber content. I mean, technically though, I should say they're both fruits, right? I mean, a squash, pumpkin, zucchini, cucumbers, if we speak botanically, they are fruits. So little bit of a gray area there. But for what we typically refer to as fruits, right? You know, the citrus, the berries, the bananas, the apples. You know, it's much better to go with vegetables when you can.
Great. And I'll answer one more question, and then I really thought with 15 minutes we'd get through all the Q&A. Unfortunately, there's a lot more on here that we didn't get to answer, but this last one I want to answer because I think there was some confusion. So the question is, one of us said wheat bran is detrimental, and the other one of us listed it as a recommended food. So I think, and Dr. Bagnulo, you can comment on this too. My perspective as a clinical dietitian is variety is everything. And so if somebody is like taking an enteral nutrition formula and the only fiber they're getting is like a wheat bran, that can certainly be detrimental. But somebody who's taking an oral diet, who's getting, you know, lots of fruits and vegetable fiber, lots of beans and legume fiber, if you're adding some wheat, you know, a small amount of wheat bran or wheat germ or any of those whole grain types, I don't have issues with that as a clinician, given that it's eaten in a large variety situation of other fiber sources. So we didn't mean to confusion there and say contradicting things, but hopefully that clarifies that. Dr. Bagnulo, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's a good explanation.
Okay, so like I said, y'all, there is a lot of other questions on here we didn't get to. I really apologize for that. By the end of the day, we will be sending out your continuing education certificate and the references. This was recorded, so in about 2 weeks to 3 weeks, the recording will be available on our website, and you will get an email indicating it's available. And as always, we really appreciate your time, your amazing questions, and your support. So I hope everybody has a really wonderful rest of their week and is staying cool. And thank you, Dr. Bagnulo, for your time today.
Thank you, Laura. Take care.
Yes, you too. Bye-bye, everybody.